In this video, I'm going to make a simple silver band ring. The first step is to decide what size ring you want to make. I'm using this commercial ring sizer to size my finger and decide what size ring I want to make. When you find one that fits, you just want to look at the number on the ring, and if it has a dash, that means half, so this is a size 6.5. Use a B&S gauge to determine how thick your metal is. I'm going to slide my piece of metal into these slots on the side, and I can see that I'm working with a 16 gauge piece of metal. I'm going to use the ring sizing chart in this book to determine the length of metal I need to make a size 6.5 ring in 16 gauge metal. The metal gauges are listed across the top of the chart, and ring sizes are listed down the left side. You want to look for the ring size that you're trying to make, in my case a 6.5, and go to the metal thickness. So I need a 56.8 length of metal to make a size 6.5 ring. I'm going to use dividers to accurately measure and mark 56.8 millimeters on my length of metal. So I'm going to open up the dividers to 56.8 millimeters, getting as close as I can to that decimal, because you really can't see tenths of millimeters on most rulers, so you can round a little bit. And then I'm going to use the edge of my metal as a straight edge, and the dividers are going to scribe a straight line where I need to cut 56.8 millimeters. I'm going to use my saw to carefully cut the excess metal away. I'm working with silver, so I want to save that scrap. It can be recycled. And now I need to file my edges flat. This is a little bit harder than it sounds because you need to file really accurately and keep your two edges parallel to each other. Now I'm going to use a pair of pliers to bend my two edges around so that they meet and create a seam to solder. You want to be careful that you don't dig your pliers into your metal, so try to use the strength of your fingers. And I like to actually push my metal a little past where I want it to be, and it's going to pop into place. And I like to do that a couple times to make sure that my seam fits really well. At this point, I'm really not worried about making this ring round. I'm just concerned with getting my seam to touch really seamlessly. So I'm pushing my metal a little beyond the seam, letting it pop back into place, and it starts to be a really nice tight fit. It's going to be a D shape when you're done, so don't worry about being round. You really want this to look really nice and gap-free for soldering. Filing this flat and fitting it tight has made a nice, clean, tight fit for soldering. I'm going to flux my ring inside, outside, top, and bottom, and then I just want to lay it flat right on the honeycomb pad for soldering. I'm going to use hard solder. Even though this band ring only has the one solder seam, this ring could be the first step in something much more complicated, so it's a nice idea to go ahead and use hard solder. I want my solder ball to sit right on top of the seam and touch both sides of the ring. And I want to heat each side of that ring seam really evenly. Even though it's all one piece of metal, each side of the seam is going to need to reach solder temperature at the same time in order for the solder to flow down the seam. So I'm heating my metal, and you're going to see that little solder ball just flow right down the seam. And it flowed. I can take my flame away, and I need to let that cool a little bit before I quench it. I've pickled this ring, and now I'm ready to form it into a round shape. I'm going to do that on a ring mandrel. So I'm going to force it down on the mandrel a little and then use a rawhide mallet to tap that ring around the mandrel. I can use a combination of my fingers to push it down and the rawhide mallet to form it, using the bench if I need to a little bit. The rawhide mallet's going to form that ring without damaging the surface and without adding hammer marks. It's just going to form the ring right around the mandrel. So I'm going to hammer the ring until it's round. And because the mandrel's tapered, I do like to take it off the mandrel and hammer it the other direction just a bit. So I flipped it around. I'm going to hammer it a little bit more. It's going to be nice and round. And sometimes to get it off the mandrel, you may have to use the mallet to tap it to get it off if you've hit it pretty hard on there. That's what I'm doing here. And then I'm just going to check the size. So I was aiming for a size 6.5, and it's a perfect size 6.5. Now I'm going to use a split mandrel on my flex shaft to clean the inside of my ring. So I just want to put a strip of wet dry sandpaper in that split mandrel, and it needs to be a flag flying to the left so that when I step on the foot pedal of my flex shaft, it spins into a drum. And then I'm just going to use that split mandrel to sand the inside of the ring. Notice how I have my hands touching for lots of control, and I'm just going to sand the inside and remove any marks that the ring mandrel might have made, and I can really get the solder seam to totally disappear. I think it's important to remember that a split mandrel like this for sanding is great for the insides of rings, but it can look really sloppy if you sand the outsides of your pieces with this type of tool. I'm going to continue sanding the inside until it's perfectly smooth. Here you can see the solder seam on the outside, but on the inside it completely disappears because I've sanded it. Now you can clean up the outside of the ring. I recommend doing this with a sanding stick, but there's a lot of choices at this point. You could choose to finish your ring in a variety of ways, from polishing to adding a hammer texture to engraving to soldering more elements on and making something more complicated. A band ring is a really important first step in fabricating handmade jewelry.